Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. My name is Doug Brunke. I am the founder and CEO of Global Chamber. I'm also the acting executive director for the Phoenix chapter. I'm very happy and pleased that we are now doing the second export league for the city of Phoenix, which extends across the state of Arizona. It's a program that for this region is being sponsored by the city of Phoenix. Mayor Gallego and actually the mayor before her, Greg Stanton, have been amazing supporters of Global Chamber. So in our 10-year life, there have been two mayors of Phoenix. Greg Stanton hosted the Global Chamber 10 years ago at City Hall. That's where we did our launch event. He has been an incredible supporter, has been an amazing supporter. He started events for Global Chamber Phoenix that included the International State of the Metro, where we talked about how important global business is for the city of Phoenix. 10 years or so ago, Phoenix was not very global. It was one of the real inspirations for me seeing how little of global business was visible in Phoenix, and to have leaders like Greg Stanton, then Mayor Stanton, now U.S. Representative Stanton, to recognize that we needed to be better, we needed to be smarter, we needed to be more global. Subsequently, in the coming years, other people understood that. Phoenix, the city of Phoenix, and the region, several things happened. One was Hank Marshall, who was working for the city of Phoenix, recognized that the cities within the region were somewhat competitive in terms of attracting companies, and they weren't necessarily working together, and that it would make sense to work together. So Hank had been a leader along with the Greater Phoenix Economic Council, Barry Broom, before the current leader, Chris Camacho. Both of them recognized the need, along with Hank, for the cities and the region to work together on a global side. And where 10 years or so ago, there was 1/10 of a person at GPEC doing international activities, now there are multiple people doing it. And just as a quick example, with TSMC coming to Phoenix, tens of billions of dollars invested to build the world's leading semiconductor plants in North America coming to Phoenix. With all of that happening, whereas 4 or 5 years ago, there were almost no Taiwanese companies in Phoenix, there are now dozens. I know more specifically the situation with Japanese companies. When we started the Semiconductor Summit with Global Chamber 4 years ago, there were 40 Japanese companies in Phoenix. There's now almost 100. And so that's how fast and how rapid international is changing here, mainly because of TSMC, mainly because the region decided to work together and come up with a strategy that said we're going to attract advanced manufacturing companies and we're going to help support them in exporting. When companies are from another country and they come to the US, they tend to be exporters and improve exporting. Only 5% of US companies are foreign owned, but they account for 20% of the exports. And so when you think about it, that makes sense, because when you're international, you're already thinking about where you might be able to sell your product. And so that'll be undoubtedly a key part of when we launch Export League here in this second time here in Phoenix, which starts today. We look for companies that have already exported. We look for companies that understand how to export, are open to exporting, understand the challenges to exporting, and are open to training. And so we did not do a training program the first time we did Export League, but fortunately this time we are. And we're very honored and very pleased to have Laura Raguto of the Forum for International Trade Training, FITT, as a trainer. And I'm going to let Eugene Sohn introduce her, and then I'll come back after Laura speak. So I'd like to first introduce, as part of this launch of Global Chamber Export League for Phoenix, I'd like to introduce Eugene Sohn. She started at Global Chamber as a project manager. She's interested in exporting. She's has a degree in that from developed in South Korea. She's visiting the United States through the summer here in Arizona and working on export programs for us. And she's leading Export League for Phoenix. She's getting that set up next in India and then set up in several other cities around the world. So Phoenix is going to be kicking off this series of export leagues for Global Chamber around the world. So we're very fortunate to have Eugene here leading this program. And we're very fortunate to have Laura from FIT as our first trainer. We're going to be doing this program for another 40 to 45 minutes with the training from Laura, with some time for Q&A. Eugene, I turn it over to you to introduce Laura and maybe also to introduce the program.
Hi everyone. As Doug introduced me, my name is Eugene and I'm part of participating a Korean program called Korea West. And I'm working at our HQ of Global Chamber as marketing manager since last December. And now I'm part of leading Expert League from last month. And the events will be continued the following a few months. And today's the speaker is called Laura. She's worker at FITT, and we'll invited her to give participants to even kind of training. And yeah, so Laura, could you please introduce yourself to people?
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, both Doug and Eugene. So let me I'll just, then I have an introductory slide in there. As both mentioned, Laura Rigudo, I am a CITP, and I wanted to show this on the screen, not because I like looking at myself on this picture. It's a very large picture. We're going to have to do something about that. But what you can see in the picture is that this is not I've been in this industry for a long time. The lines on my face show that. So I have it says 20 plus years, more like 25 plus years in international trade and business, international business expansion. I actually, out of university, I moved to Spain for a year, became fluent in Spanish, came back to Toronto. And at the time, they had just negotiated NAFTA, which now we know is CUSMA or the USMCA. And I thought I would work for either a Canadian company looking to expand into Mexico or a Mexican company looking to expand into Canada. But I ended up working for ProChile, which is the Trade Commission of Chile. I was based in Toronto. I was a local hire. So I was there for over a decade promoting Chilean, the export of Chilean products into Canada and bilateral relations, investment flows in general between the two countries. And during that time, actually, Canada signed a free trade agreement with Chile. So it was the first free trade agreement that Canada had signed with a South American country. So I was part of negotiations, part of all the B2B trade missions that went back and forth between the two countries, and just absolutely fascinating and a great time to be working in international trade. But during that time, I thought I knew everything about international trade because, heck, I was working for a trade commission. But then I was introduced to FIT. And at the time, I read their training programs, and the trade commissioner, who was also the consul general, who then became ambassador, Chilean ambassador, we decided to take that first course, and that first course was called Global Entrepreneurship. And both of us were quite amazed that there were a lot of complexities that we really didn't have a handle on. And so we took that first course together, of course, competed over marks. But then I went on later to continue all my training. And so the Fit Skills training is a program of 6 courses, everything from feasibility of international trade through to international sales and marketing, global market entry, global value chain, and trade finance. So there's a whole program of 6 courses. With the program, with the diploma of international trade, so that's a credential after an individual successfully passes 6 courses. So with that diploma, I already had 3 years of international business experience. So I applied for the CITP designation. So the CITP designation is the leading designation for professionals working in international trade. We have competency standards, and it's quite a rigorous process to go through, and it's globally recognized. We have, over the years, FIT has certified over 1,800 professionals in over 50 countries around the globe. We have our 2 biggest endorsements are from Global Affairs Canada, or the Trade Commissioner Service. So they have a mandate that trade commissioners are certified international trade professionals, as well as Export Development Canada, EDC for short. That is Canada's export credit agency. They as well have a mandate that their trade advisors are certified international trade professionals. If you see on the bottom of this slide, it's co-branded with EDC. So FIT EDC, we provide our training through the Learning Center, and it is the FIT EDC Learning Center. So we partnered with them a few years ago to offer this FIT skills training. As you can see, just from, that's a little bit of an introduction, how I got into international trade and why I love it so much, and just the backing of that designation really does open doors. It gives me the confidence to speak, because I am a subject matter expert. I have gone through the training myself. I have that experience, and you know, just mentioning that I'm a CITP opens me up to a network of other trade professionals around the globe. I'm also a certified Incoterms trainer. I'm going to touch on Incoterms a little bit today because this is a training session, and we can't have a training session on international trade without touching on Incoterms. I've been teaching for about 10 years on a part-time basis. And I mentioned here, which Doug picked up on, I'm a member of the Organization of Women in International Trade, the Toronto chapter, because I'm located actually in the Toronto region. FIT is headquartered in Ottawa, Canada, but I'm located in Toronto. So today, there's only so much training you can do. My objective today is just to provide you with an overview of some of the key areas where companies, where exporters need to be aware that there are differences in selling your products or delivering your services in new international markets. So I want to touch on some of those complexities, touch on some of the risks involved. And we're going to walk through everything from export readiness, market feasibility. Is it truly feasible to export your product or deliver your service in a market? How suitable are your products or services for new international markets? Touch on market entry strategies, a little bit of international sales and marketing, supply chain logistics, and then just touch on those key areas of international trade finance that all exporters should have on their radar. So why export? So we know that, you know, exporting can be profitable for businesses of all sizes. So often when I'm speaking with a group of startups, often the feeling is that, oh, we're just too small to start exporting. But small companies can grow larger, can be more successful, and can be in it for the long run if they do find, you know, if they do start exporting and find new international customers, they can be more profitable. On average, sales grow faster, more jobs are created, and companies who export gain a significant competitive advantage. What's important is that every company needs to understand their own motivational factors, whether it's to generate new revenue streams or increase capabilities. Maybe it's for long-term expansion and longevity, and maybe it's to increase competitiveness. So it's very important to understand what your motivational factor is before you start creating that export plan or international business plan, whatever you want to call it. Here's a fantastic article that was written by Export Development Canada. As I mentioned, they're Canada's export credit agency. And it's just, and I can leave you, Doug, with a copy of this presentation, but it's just basically highlighting the 7 reasons from everything, you know, how you would get more revenue by exporting, or economic resilience. So we talk a lot about market diversification, and I'm not going to get political in today's training session, but a lot of what our training is about being prepared. In order to take advantage of the opportunities, the global opportunities to export your products or services, you need to be prepared to seize those opportunities and to be able to critically assess whether the opportunity is truly an opportunity for you. So looking at your motivation is paramount before you create that export plan. So we know we've just touched on some of the advantages of exporting, but we now need to move over to some of the challenges of exporting. So we understand, we should understand that there are increased costs and risks. It does take longer, often, to export into a new international market. Payment terms could be longer. Instead of your 30 days or 15 days, 30 days with a domestic buyer, now you're talking maybe 2 months, 3 months, whatever those payment terms are. And if you want to do business with that buyer, you have to be prepared to extend those same payment terms to that buyer. And foreign exchange risks. So we know about the volatility of different currencies. So there could be foreign exchange risks involved in terms of currency fluctuations, also in terms of, depending on the market you're choosing to do business in, there could be exchange risks with, you know, repatriating your profits out of the country. So I know that Argentina, for example, has restrictions on the repatriation of your profits out of Argentina. So there are, you know, there are some areas which possess more risks for the exporter. The level of commitment is longer. So sometimes to land that first contract, it could take several trips, several business trips back and forth, trade missions, trips, because in some cultures, doing business like we are today through Zoom, it just doesn't work. They want that face-to-face. They want that, you know, that business development, that relationship building, and that can go on for several years. I was with a company, I was with a manufacturer, and we were trying to do business in India. And 3 years later, we felt like we were still on the same, you know, in that first getting to know you phase. It just took a really long time. So you have to understand that oftentimes the level of commitment is longer. Languages can be very different, time zones. And then there are other cultural differences, how you negotiate.
Going on. Shopping with you.
Yeah. how you negotiate with buyers could be different. How contracts are set up could be different. So those are some of the cultural differences. Increased paperwork, the structure of contracts can be significantly different depending on which region of the world, which country you're doing business in. And accessibility, is that market accessible to you? And what is the level of competition like in that market? So these can be some of the challenges. Before we look at jumping into an opportunity, maybe in some cases the opportunity lands in somebody's inbox, in your company's inbox, and you think, oh, great, you know, we've got an order here from, I don't know, Saudi Arabia. And but before we look at exporting to that country, we really need to see if we're truly ready to take on exporting to that different market. So typically successful exporting organizations, their products and services are successful domestically or in one other export market. Unique in one or more ways. There has to be something, your unique value proposition has to be there. There has to be something unique and to differentiate you from the competition. And your product must be competitively priced, or your service competitively priced. Doesn't mean you have to be the lowest price, but there has to be value there with your pricing. The characteristics of an organization are that you have some proven effectiveness with your business plan, specific advantages over the competition. The organization has to understand that there's a and understand that it takes more time and a willingness to invest their resources into making this export venture a success. So time, people, and capital without a return for a period of time. Organization has to be sensitive to and aware of cultural differences and doing business in other countries. And often they've conducted a thorough gap analysis or done, you know, an export readiness assessment where they assess their current state. And then from that, they can define what gaps they have. So the gaps could be that if the company's trying to export into, well, I'll say Chile, export into Chile, maybe they don't have somebody on staff that speaks Spanish. Maybe they don't have an individual that is able to navigate some of the complexities of getting their product or service into that market. So maybe they need to hire someone, maybe a CITP, a certified international trade professional, or an individual with that skill set that's required in order to assess the market and to determine if there are, you know, if there are any roadblocks, if the company can comply with certain regulations, where you find those regulations, et cetera, et cetera. And then come up with a plan to address those gaps. So market feasibility. So a lot of FIT's training is about assessing markets to determine if it's truly feasible to export to that market. So screening the markets. Is the market large enough? Is there growth potential in that market? Can I access that market? Do I have those, you know, can I comply with the regulation in the market? Or are there any trade restrictions on products coming into that market? So screening markets takes a lot of research, but it's well worth the time that you invest at the beginning. If the market's not accessible to you, it's not worth it to spend more time, you know, trying to create a business plan to enter into that market if it's just not accessible. Establish, once you've done the research, initial research, establish some priorities. There's got to be that perfect, you know, organization, product or service, and market fit. It's got to be a true, you know, a true marriage so to see that true potential in the market. Market research and primary and secondary sources. there's a lot that goes into researching a potential markets, and I know that there's somebody here is from the foreign, the trade service. So I've seen a lot of the reports that organization has put out, and a lot of those reports are accessible. They're online, they're free, at least they were the last time I looked. So there's a tremendous amount of secondary information that's available to you. So the secondary sources are reports, data that's already been collected. You're not going out and creating this. So taking advantage of that data that's out there, taking advantage of the different reports that are put out by various levels of government, from municipal to state to federal level. So these are all excellent sources of secondary information. Industry associations has great secondary information that is available to you if you're exporting a food product, for example. So being part of an industry association for food and beverage, they often have great market reports for various countries as well. Specialized assistance, sometimes it might make sense to hire a researcher, a contractor to get that, to create a report for you, which truly assesses the potential in a particular target market. And then primary sources of information, those are I always say the best source of information, primary information, is to take part in a trade show. Trade shows, you can speak to multiple players under one roof, especially if it's a global trade show. You could be speaking with buyers from all over the world. You could be speaking with other channel intermediaries. So trade shows, really, when you're assessing your ROI to whether you take part in that trade show or not, like often the ROI is really high if it's a global trade show and you're setting up all kinds of B2B meetings at the same time. It can be quite cost effective. Not to mention that there's often funding available through governments to take part in a very targeted international trade show. So that's always a great way to obtain primary market research. And then you need to, with all that research, you need to truly assess the market potential. If you can comply with all the regulations, if there's, if you have information that helps you determine that there's tremendous growth potential in the market, that it's trending upwards, that more and more buyers are purchasing your type of product or service. Then you need to assess your own cost. So understanding what is the total landed cost of delivering your product or your service into that market. What is that landed cost? Do you understand the transportation costs? This is where Incoterms comes in. I'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about pricing, but getting that full picture view of costs, because if you don't earn a margin, like what's the point of exporting into that new target market if you're not going to be earning enough of a margin to make it worthwhile? So, but that's only starts with having a full picture view of the costs involved. So we went over this, how you screen your markets, the 3 steps to doing that, and then secondary and primary research. Suitability of your products or services. So understanding that when you go into
Laura, are you there?
Yep.
Yeah, when you started this slide, you broke up, and that's the 3rd time it broke up where we don't hear you. So just, could you start over on this slide?
Sure. Thank you.
You bet.
So suitability of your products or services. If you're entering into a new market, you have to determine whether you have the right product or product service mix for that market. So Looking at adaptation, do you need to adapt your product or your service in any way in order to either comply with regulations in the market or to make your product or service more marketable in the market? So it's a whole process of looking at the market, determining it's not whether you need to adapt something, what you need to adapt. In some cases, it could be as simple as your labeling, your packaging, languages. If the market you're going into requires 6 languages to be printed, like on your packaging or on your labels, then that's one thing that needs to be changed up. But in other cases, the more needs to be adapted for your product or service. Looking at that regulatory compliance piece is paramount, because that will determine whether or not you can enter into that market. So if there's a certain standard you need to comply with, if there's a regulation you need to meet. So looking that whole compliance piece is paramount. The product liability piece, you need to spend some time assessing, what are some of the risks involved? What is the legislation like in the market? What if somebody gets hurt by using your product, or by, consuming your product, or your service? You're delivering a service in a market. What if somebody gets injured? What is the legislation around that? And what does your product, your whole product liability, what does that look like for your individual company? And then IP protection. Are you aware of all the risks in the market in terms of IP? So do you need to protect your IP? Do you need to, I don't know, a trademark in the market that you're going into, your copyright, trademark, whatever that might be, a patent? So you have to look at that intellectual property piece carefully, because if you enter into a market that maybe it's very risky in terms of IP infringement, maybe that's a decision that you make, that it might not be worth the risk to enter into that market. So when we talk about adaptation decisions, we're often talking about there should be something that you modify. And I made the reference to, maybe it's just the labeling, maybe it's just the packaging. So everything from making minor changes all the way through to maybe you create a product that is truly global in nature. But you have to determine what modifications or adaptations need to be made for each new international market you're going into. The cultural piece can't be underestimated. So we have here the cultural iceberg. Maybe some of you have seen it before, which basically talks about, the observable cultural differences, clothing, food, language, art. Those are the observable cultural factors, but it's the non-observable ones that really come into play when we're meeting with buyers, when we're trying to create that product and get that product into the market. What is their belief system? What do they value? And it may be very different from what is valued in your domestic market. So look, maybe in some markets they just don't product or service. They're not willing to pay that price. In other markets they might be. So looking at all of these factors is really can determine whether, how you're going to set your price, how you're going to market in this new target market, how you're going to, promote, how you're going to establish those relationships in the beginning. So when we talk about, I'm just looking at the time. Okay. When we talk about international sales and marketing, and this is my favorite course to teach. I spend many, many weeks teaching this course, but I'll just give you a basic high level overview of the main areas you need to keep in mind. So sales and marketing, the marketing mix. And I have this little graph in the middle. And what that represents is that the marketing mix, so product, price, place, and promotion, that mix should change for each target market you go into. It should not be cookie cutter. So just because in a target market, I'll say maybe Canada. So if any exporter is exporting to Canada and you export these products to Canada, and you place them through a distributor, and then you price them with X price, and then you promote it through, I don't know, you promote it through social media, maybe LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, I don't know, and you have an email blast, whatever that might be. That might work. That's your unique marketing mix for Canada. But if you're going into Mexico, you need to evaluate what's going to be different. Are you going to offer the same products in Mexico that you might offer in Canada? You don't necessarily need to offer your whole product line or offer all your services. So you have to look at what products or services are you going to offer in the market. How are you going to place your product in the market? Is it through distributors? Is it direct to consumer? Are you going to go straight to the retailer? What does that look like? And that needs to be unique for every market you go into. Pricing. So I have here under pricing, unique challenges. So I always tell people there are two factors you need to consider. So when you're pricing, if you are a product exporter, you should never quote without using an Incoterm. An Incoterm is an international commercial term. There are 11 of them. So we've probably all heard of XWorks or FOB. But oftentimes exporters either use an Incoterm that they're not really quite familiar with all of the obligations, or if they're sourcing products, they accept an Incoterm that they really don't understand the full extent of all the obligations. So Incoterms are universal. As I mentioned, they're international commercial terms. So it doesn't matter if your buyer is in Vietnam and Korea and Chile, in Canada, wherever that is, that three-letter acronym will spell out all of the obligations on the part of the seller and the part of the buyer or exporter and importer. And so it avoids having to spell out all those clauses in a contract. Because with that three-letter Incoterm, you understand, oh, if it's FOB, if you're exporting and you say FOB Port of Los Angeles, well, then your buyer understands that they are responsible for loading the goods onto the ship, actually not loading, but they are responsible for everything else from when the goods are loaded on the ship all the way through to their country, right? That's with FOB. But if you then quoted, cost, insurance, and freight, then their responsibility would start as soon as that ship arrived in the port, wherever their port is, and offloading. So there's a whole bunch of categories of obligations and costs. So knowing Incoterms, because I always use the example of a box of chocolate. A box of chocolate, say a $10 box of chocolate at your factory, is very different than a $10 box of chocolate delivered to an importer in Italy, right? Because if you XWorks at your factory, your buyer comes, picks it up at your factory, you can't be offering that same box of chocolates for $10 in another foreign country. So understanding the Incoterms, the other unique challenge is quoting whatever currency, understanding what currency you're quoting in. If it's the US dollar, great, but it doesn't always have to be the US dollar. You might want to quote using the euro, you might want to quote using the yen, whatever that is, understanding that there are currency risks involved. So pegging your price list using the currency, it's a choice. You don't have to quote in US dollars. And just like as I say to Canadian exporters, you don't have to quote in Canadian dollars. You could quote in US dollars, but that is a decision and that is part of your pricing strategy. So those are the two unique challenges that I wanted to mention here. And then, so all of these elements are interconnected. So how you place your product will determine what your price is. Are you placing it through a distributor? So you have to have a price list, distributor pricing, or if it's through to the retailer, your retail price list, retail pricing on your price list, whatever that might be. And depending on your product or service will also determine how you're going to promote that product. If you're a manufacturer of some heavy equipment, obviously your social media channels are going to be very different. It's nothing, nothing very sexy about, a piece of mining equipment, for instance, is not really, in my mind, not really Instagram worthy, like, a beautiful piece of chocolate or something, but understanding what social media channels are used in the market you're going into. So that's just a little bit about the promotion piece.
Laura?
Yep.
Just as a time check, we've got a few more minutes, and then Mike Patterson has joined, and so we'd like to have him say a few words after your conversation. So we've got a few more minutes of this introductory presentation.
Perfect. Okay. So what I wanted to mention, just that e-commerce piece, there's not enough time to talk about it, but understanding e-commerce, what are your requirements? How are you going to localize your sites? How are you going to set up your e-commerce operations? What does that look like? So there's a lot there. We won't talk about it, but there are many considerations to work out in that area. Market entry strategies. There's choosing the correct market entry strategy depending on, and I mentioned that in the marketing mix, like how you're going to place your product. So this goes with, how you're going to enter the market. So it could be trade entry strategy, transfer. You could be looking at something like licensing, franchising, or foreign direct investment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. There's a lot here for supply chain. We have a whole course on it's called Global Value Chain, and it's all about the process, whether it's procurement, like whether you're importing supplies or if you're exporting, understanding that whole supply chain piece, logistics, what's involved. And then trade finance. I'm only going to mention a few areas. The bottom of this slide talks about additional financing considerations. So, that payment risk. Now you're dealing with a buyer in a new market that you may have never worked with before. So how are you going to mitigate some of those risks of getting paid? Are you going to reach out to an export credit agency? Are you going to help cover, get insurance to cover those receivables? Or what are you going to work with? Letters of credit. There's a lot to consider there. Currency risks, I mentioned about sometimes the restrictions on repatriating your profits out of a country. Could be currency risk, depending on what you quote, what currency you quote in. There could be many fluctuations. So you lead to exposure there. Country risk, how stable is the market that you're going into? And then looking and, are there other risks involved, social, political, economic risks involved in that country? And then cash flow. Do you have the cash flow? Let's say you get a huge order. Do you have the necessary working capital to fulfill that order? Because you might not get paid, as I mentioned at the very beginning, you might not get paid for several months. And then understanding what tools and assistance is available for you. Okay, all these courses are taken, I mentioned in my introduction that it's a program of 6 courses. So this is our diploma in international trade. These 6 courses, this is our foundation. So content from this little presentation was taken from all 6 of these courses. For Global Chamber members, we have, and for non-members, we have 2 codes on the screen. So if you do want to explore some of our courses, you can visit edc-fit.com. And at that time when you're purchasing a course, you could put in the code that corresponds to whether you're a Global Chamber member or a non-member. And we're using this to track the interest from Global Chamber members or those that take part in Global Chamber events such as this one today. So thank you, and I will stay on the line if there are any questions at the end.
Fantastic. We have overall about 5 minutes, and I'd like to introduce Mike Patterson. Mike is an attorney. He's an expert on setting up companies for business in the U.S. He's also spent 10 years in Mexico. Besides being a legal and a business expert, he also has a mariachi band and speaks Spanish. He's an extraordinary international leader. And Mike, you've thankfully were able to hear a lot of that presentation. You could teach this yourself. What did you hear that impacted you? And then what else should exporters be thinking about from your own experience? Thanks for joining.
Laura, that was awesome. Fantastic presentation, and the availability to do training to others in this area is incredible. Doug and I are Secretary of Commerce appointed members of the District Export Council in Arizona, which is going through its own analysis of how to provide classes and training to get Arizona's companies up and ready and running and exporting, doing their first export, doing their 10th export, actually figure out what they're doing wrong on their 100th export, you know what I mean, and increase the export readiness of Arizona companies and U.S. companies in general, because I'm a lawyer in a firm of 600 attorneys in 29 cities across the U.S., so we're covering the whole country. I, in my personal practice, I have a deck on doing international distribution, covered some of the issues that you do, but also down into the nitty-gritty of the potholes in the agreements, where things go wrong and how to draft around them, etc. I do speak in Spanish. I do have a Mexican foreign legal consultant on my staff, but we're not just Mexico. I'm the lawyer for the reason I'm late is the Canada Arizona Business Council. I'm their lawyer. We had our quarterly meeting today, and I came late. I'm sorry. Missed the first part of your presentation. Laura, if you would see, my email is in the chat. If you wouldn't mind sharing your presentation, I'd like to look at the rest of it. And then also, I think I have a referral for you. I think not only to connect you with our District Export Council, but someone else who is working on training and looking for it and partnership in that area. I'd like to make you a referral on that. Then we do formations in the various countries that you go to. I know I'm part of 3 legal networks internationally. I know lawyers in every major city on the globe and really know them. I've on a first name basis from conferences. I'm old enough. I'm getting older, and I actually had time to get to know them. But to form an entity wherever you go for limited liability, and I work with a lot of inbound companies for Arizona from Asia. I was just with a Japanese delegation yesterday. Doug was too. Inbound companies that are flocking here for our supply chain for the semiconductor industry. And Doug had his big semiconductor summit on a 4th annual on Wednesday as well. There's Japanese companies coming here in March that are in bio and I'm telling everybody, form an entity when you get here. It's cheap. You draw a circle around it. If the IRS decides to audit you and determine which part of your worldwide income relates to the U.S., well, you've drawn a little circle around it, and so hopefully they just audit this and don't go back to Japan and audit the rest of you. There are joint venture agreements, and when you go into various countries, she get excellent issue spotting on, and we would execute on that. Like, for example, your intellectual property, have you registered where you're going? Well, she will look at it, do the analysis, and then maybe send you our way to go actually get it registered, either individually in the country or under the Madrid Protocol. Employment law, real estate, IT agreements, the capital raising she mentioned, to raise the capital to go. And we also work with U.S. Commercial Service and Ex-Im Bank. Our U.S. government is a big promoter of exporting, and they will help you not only with the lending, but also the actual guarantees as you go into places, so that you don't get caught holding the hook on a big receivable. And when there's cross-border litigation, I've got a team of people that do international arbitration, international litigation. We're involved in a few right now, and it's never enjoyable, but you want a good partner to help you. And so, Laura, would love to get to know you better. Please text me or email. My cell phone is in the chat, and if we can connect with it or anyone else, I'm here, happy to help. Thank you, Doug.
Hey, Mike, and so we're going to go over the hour. So just to everybody know that, so that appreciate your patience as we fully complete this program. It's important because this recording is going to be used to support the Export League next steps. There's a couple points that I'd like to make, Mike. One was, at the beginning, we announced that the Forum for International Trade Training, FIT, that Laura's part of, has signed a collaboration agreement with Global Chamber. And so that actually is out on social media today. You'll probably see it in our different forums. It'll be, I'm sure, a headline item in the newsletter on Monday. So we're very happy, pleased, and honored that FIT has chosen to collaborate with Global Chamber. So you'll be hearing more and more about it. Kind of on that same note, as the Arizona District Export Council has been talking about putting together certification training and things like that, I've mentioned FIT along the way, but no one really kind of listened because no one has known about FIT, and probably the natural tendency is let's do it ourselves, which for me is not the right approach. For me, that doesn't make any sense to recreate what FIT already does better than anyone else in the world. And so I hope that maybe you and I together can begin to introduce what FIT is doing, and instead of trying to do something that's already been done, let's bring FIT to the table and let them be part of it. And I think that goes to my second point that I'd like to make to everybody, that as I've been listening, Laura, to you and also to Mike, almost everything you guys have talked about is problematic and is a challenge and is complicated and is difficult. And I want to make sure that if you're either an early exporter or whatever stage you're in, doesn't really matter, that exporting is doable, is possible. The opportunities are endless. You need to be global and unstoppable. One of the reasons why people don't export is they've listened like today and said, oh my God, this is way too complicated. I'm never going to be able to do it. And probably even before that, or in parallel to that, what's happened is oh my God, that's got to be certified. It's got to be like, there's so many different pieces to it. So here's the good news. The good news is there's people like Laura. There's people like Mike, and there is Laura and Mike specifically that are available to help. Mike and Laura make it easy. Easy might be an over exaggeration. They make it so much easier than has been portrayed today. When we're explaining it in terms of all the things you need to think about, when you think about getting just a product out to market, period, whether it's exported or not, that is a complicated process to be able to develop a product, to understand the market needs and to price it and all the different pieces. Business is complicated. Over 90% of startups fail. Add exporting and it gets even more complicated. So number one, it's very doable. Number two is if you're already in business and you're doing business, you can export. You just need to know the right people. And that's a lot of the reason why Global Chamber was formed, to make the process a lot easier so that you know people like Laura, that you know people like Mike, to be able to help you to the next stage. I'd like to introduce, if he's possibly available, is Jorge Canedo. Jorge is a logistics expert. He's going to be speaking in our fourth of this series. Jorge runs his own logistics company. It's a big company. They do business all over the world. He'll be in this fourth segment. It sounds like he may not be available to speak right now, but Jorge is a great example of another aspect of international business, and that is the logistics piece. Next week, we're going to be talking about finance. Laura, you had a slide on international finance, and that was about the time you were accelerating the process of your presentation, which is fine because next week, Dwight Winkler is an unbelievably knowledgeable person around all aspects of trade finance and getting your product shipped, and the economics part of it, the aspect that Laura touched on, where very often you sell a product and you're not going to get paid. You've made the product, you've costed the product, you paid all that money down, and you're not going to get paid for a month or 3 months or 6 months or longer. And sometimes product gets caught in different places and ports and places because either the paperwork wasn't done properly or somebody has stepped in. We had a member of ours in Chicago where the Customs and Border Patrol charged her $15,000 for one container, an inspection that she was not prepared for at all. And that actually kind of wiped out all of the profit on that one shipment. And now we're going back and actually Dwight Winkler has become involved with that and trying to find a way to resolve that in some equitable way. So it's complicated. There's a lot of aspects to it. You got to think about everything. But, and I'd like to get Mike, both your and Laura's perspectives on this. It is possible. It is doable. It takes a village to be able to do it. Laura, what's your advice typically for exporters not to intimidate them, that not to export?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sorry if I've done some fear mongering, but we do have to point out the challenges, because if you're prepared to export, you can't just look at it all like willy-nilly. And as I mentioned, you know, if you're just responding, if you're reacting to an inquiry that comes into your inbox and you say, oh, great, we'll export, there's a buyer wherever, you're not being strategic. And it's all about being prepared. And without really assessing the feasibility of that opportunity, you really shouldn't go into it. It may be a tremendous opportunity. Take the time, assess. It's about, all of our training is about being prepared and helping you connect the dots so that and this is like, I'm glad that Mike, you're on the line, Michael, because understanding, do the training, understanding enough to know when you should reach out to a lawyer. If understanding that if you reach out to a lawyer once you have a dispute, It's going to cost you a lot more than if you reached out to a lawyer in the beginning to set up that contract, or when to reach out to somebody like a third-party logistics provider. So you have to know enough. You have to understand the landscape to go, we don't know this. This is not our area of expertise, but we're going to reach out to those that know more of us that can help us complete this export transaction. So it's about being prepared, being strategic.
Great points. Mike, do you have a couple more minutes that you can comment also?
Yeah. You want me to comment on that, or were you going to ask me? I just wanted to encourage that it does seem daunting to get into exporting. There is a lot of extra. This isn't just like making a sale to Omaha. You know what I mean? So there is added stuff to do. I just want to give some encouragements that I've given over the years, and that is, yeah, but once you have accomplished this, that, and the other, it's doable. But then also, there are less of your competitors who've gone to the trouble in this country, that country, this country, that country, and once you're in, and once you've done it, it's not the same as 40 of you are trying to compete for that same contract in Omaha. You may be the only person that makes your widget in Argentina, or that sells your widget to Argentina. The other thing is I have clients that say, only 10% of what we do is export. 90% is our normal medical device business in the United States. But I'm thinking of one client in particular, and they say, but that 10% is the most profitable 10% that we have. We're able to charge better prices there, and there because there's a scarcity of our product. There's not 100 of our competitors who've all gone to Brazil.
A really good point. So before we close out the room, I wanted to, and Eugene, I don't mind doing this. I can create the framework of what Export League is. But before we finish up, I'd love to hear from the two experts that we have in the room for any final comments. I brought up the aspect of not being intimidated, but I also realize, the points that both Laura and Mike made, and there are more things to consider when you're exporting, both on the positive side and on the negative side. I think it's important to go in, Laura, as you mentioned, with both eyes open and recognizing, though, that you can't do it alone. Many companies, even fairly large companies, have very few people who understand international business holistically. I work for a big company, and I understood it at the sales and marketing, strategic, sign the agreement or get the agreement, and how to set up the sales and marketing piece. But I had no idea of how a lot of the paperwork needs to be done, and compliance issues, unless there was some sort of a problem and then it bubbled up. And so to find one person within an organization that understands every aspect, top to bottom, of international trade is really almost impossible. There's very few people that do that. So that's why the training that FIT provides is absolutely essential for not only executives to be able to participate in, but within the organization. Laura, you and I were talking earlier, maybe before this program started, about OWIT, the Organization of Women in Trade. And I always was struck by my own process of global business, of what I get involved with, and how OWIT very often was the other aspects of international trade, like getting product out the door into a container across a port, and all of the things required that for somebody to gather all of that information is tough. So it does take a team within your own company. It takes a team beyond your company to fully understand how to do it. So I'm within that framework. I wonder if each of you could finish up with any final comments, and then what I'll do is I'll go through the Export League next steps. Mike, you're amazing. Your ability to work with companies to be able to get them to be successful and to simplify the process for you to first of all understand it and then work with people to simplify it for them is I've never met anybody better than you. So thank you for everything that you do, in addition to just being so service oriented, the best attorney for international business I've ever met by far. How would you like to conclude and make any final comments to exporters as they think about, hey, I want to get to that next country, number 2, number 5, or like one of our members, when they joined, they were at 82 countries and they were able to get fairly quickly to 85. And part of the reason was Ruby Golo, who's in this call. You know, she actually has worked for that company and helped them get to the next level. It takes a village. And Mike, you know that better than anybody.
Well, I would just say, be a member of the Global Chamber. I mean, we've gone from, day one, we were one chamber, and now we're over 500. And if you're wanting to expand your exports and the number of countries that you're in, having a good, warm relationship is key, and working